CD Projekt Red just shared some pretty big updates on Cyberpunk 2077 and really their company and plan going forward overall. As today they did share their fiscal year 2020 financial results, so we gotta look at some of the numbers around Cyberpunk. One of the most interesting numbers people are focusing on is the number of copies refunded throughout this whole situation, and how we kind of have a look at that but also kind of don't. But even further, some of the interesting responses they gave during the Q&A as far as future plans, in particular around the online or multiplayer mode that is on the way. So first and foremost, let's look at this refund situation with Cyberpunk 2077. CD Projekt Red described how Cyberpunk itself sold about 13.7 million copies overall across all platforms, with the vast majority of those being sold on PC, then PS4, and the small share being Xbox. That being interesting for a couple of reasons. Xbox and CDPR had a marketing deal for Cyberpunk, and of course it was quite literally pulled from the PlayStation Store, so you couldn't even buy it digitally for a portion of this time. Although of course it is worth mentioning, these are just the numbers up until the end of 2020. And overall, this is viewed as a pretty good success. Cyberpunk was described as having a budget of around 320 million, about 55% of that going to direct development and the other half or so going to marketing. But when it comes to the refunds after those established sales figures, they gave some interesting responses here. So the number they give first and foremost are 30,000 refund requests via the Help Me program that they established, which equated to about $2.23 million they had to pay out to fans that reached out to them directly, and describe how about 95% of those payments are complete at this point. So a lot of people are looking at this and being like, wow, so only 30,000 people actually asked for refunds? $2.23 million is not that bad when you consider the game overall cost $320 million and they sold almost 14 million copies. But this is definitely not the full picture, and in many ways almost misleading with how some of the reporting of this number is going on, because of course Help Me refund was positioned as basically being the last option. Like if you went back to your retailer, if you went back to Sony or Microsoft and all of them said no, CDPR said, okay, fine, then we will help you out if all those other people turn you away. Now I'm sure some people may have gone to CDPR first, but I'm sure the vast majority of people just went on their Xbox or went on their PlayStation and just refunded it that way, considering both Microsoft and Sony, after a bit of time, did accept refunds for everyone. And if you look at their financial statements, what you can see is through the end of 2020, allocated about 194 million PLN for refunds, which equates to about $51 million for refunds. So to be clear, this is not just refunded copies. This is basically an estimate by CDPR as far as the upper bounds of what these refunds could cost them, and include some other things like order changes from distributors, but also actual refunds themselves. And if you take that $51 million number and actually just calculate it using the same formula they used previously, this would put the actual refund number, or at least the upper bar CDPR could expect, closer to 700 to 800,000 copies refunded. Now again, that's not an exact science, that's like the absolute maximum, so it's likely going to be well below that, and this of course includes other costs, but it's clearly not just 30,000. That 30,000 number is something you could just more or less throw away. It's one piece of data, but there's really no point in focusing on it because that is simply not how many people refunded the game, it's just how many people refunded the game from CDPR directly. And it seems pretty obvious based on this larger number that more people requested refunds via Microsoft and Sony, and even just logically, I think more people probably went that route. But honestly, that's still really not that bad. For nearly 14 million copies sold, perhaps it didn't even break 500,000 refunds overall. It is another testament to how forgiving gamers are, for better or worse. Although again, all of this data is just from 2020. Looking ahead at 2021, they couldn't give any concrete details, but one of the things they did mention was the removal from the PSN store definitely did influence some of the sales, and I think it will lead to notably lower sales in Q1 of 2021 for this game. And not just lower sales on PlayStation, but actually across the board, as it almost sent a message to everyone that this game has problems. On the topic of getting back to the PlayStation store, they mentioned how with further patches the game should return to the store, and every time they release something patch-wise, they're a bit closer to getting back in the store, but the decision is still with Sony. It almost made it seem like they talked to Sony and have some kind of criteria, or they are just constantly evaluating what's going on. But with 2021, they do view a return to the Sony store as kind of a big thing, a point where players can return to the game, as it was a signal that the game is broken back last year. In 2021, when it returns, it would be a signal that the game is fixed to the broader community. Another interesting point on signaling that the game is fixed, they also describe how they feel with the next gen version, it'll have a significant significant influence on sales overall. So in the second half of 2021, at some point, the next-gen upgraded version of Cyberpunk will come for next-gen consoles, and they think the release of this will actually impact the atmosphere surrounding Cyberpunk. They describe having some more Q&A going on with some external parties, and even further how they will actually have a separate standalone marketing campaign for the next-gen version. It won't be quite as large as the pre-release marketing campaign, which was clearly costing hundreds of millions of dollars, as we heard earlier, but it seems like it will be at least somewhat sizable. They're viewing this as a major catalyst to get players back. Outside of that, things like patches and the free DLCs also coming out this year should help things. But the two major things that were really highlighted were definitely the PlayStation Store return as well as the next-gen version, which just made me excited. I think the next-gen version coming out later in the year around the holiday season could be a good time for a lot of people who passed on this game to give another chance. I imagine they'll really try and push that one as, okay, our game's good now, we didn't make the same mistake twice. Although on this topic, something else interesting that you describe is how the vast majority of developers are still working on Cyberpunk. During the presentation, they mentioned how around 530 people worked on the game in-house and 5,000 people overall. So several hundred people are working right now on patching the game and on the next gen version, not even on some of those DLCs. They have some smaller teams on the next Cyberpunk content, as well as a small multiplayer team that is reportedly quite connected to the core Cyberpunk team, as reportedly some of the stuff that the multiplayer team is working on will be added in single player as well. There's no follow-up questions on that one. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but even further, how some of the people on this smaller multiplayer team have been working on things for over 2 years now. And they further clarified their plan with multiplayer. There was a lot of reporting that they canceled the multiplayer mode, and it doesn't really seem like that's the case. They rather are just taking a different approach, and right now their plan is working on those features and incrementing on them step by step rather than one big release. So over time, Cyberpunk will get multiplayer. It won't just be in 2022 or 2023, hey, here's Cyberpunk multiplayer. Rather, it's going to be between now and 2023. We'll see it slowly grow over time, as it seems like one of their core strategies here is going to be releasing stuff and then listening to player feedback to refine it, then adding in the next major feature. And they think this will be a much less risky approach to adding multiplayer, and they still have a much larger focus on single players. They talk a bit about some of the major problems they had, how the cyber attacks saw their systems getting restored from backups for 2 to 3 weeks depending on department, so they lost 2 to 3 weeks of dev time or work time, and they weren't actually attacked directly. The attack was done via a third-party application. It's not like CDPR's systems themselves were compromised. And one thing I feel like basically everyone forgot about, there's lawsuits going on with Cyberpunk 2077. They mentioned how they're still pushing for a motion to dismiss some of those lawsuits, and they did not allocate any money for them as far as payouts or anything like that thus far. It seems like those are still very early on. Cyberpunk 2077 finds itself in a weird or interesting spot right now. We of course just saw patch 1.2 come out around 20 days ago, and it didn't really lead to a huge boost in players. On Steam, we could see an initial peak and some minor bumps, but it didn't really seem like a ton of people returned for the long haul, as things quickly fell off in the following weeks. You can see here things are slightly higher than the previous 30 days, but there's no monumental jump or a ton of new interest in the game. And on Xbox, it has continued to bleed players pretty much consistently, now about to fall off the top 50 games on Xbox. And that's not to say that CDPR shouldn't be putting in work or effort to fixing the game, but it does make you wonder how much it's paying off. I imagine that return to the PlayStation Store really will act as a big catalyst, and we may see some people finally give the game a chance. Either way, it'll be interesting what happens in the future. With E3 just a couple of months away now, I imagine we hear or see something. For one reason or another, we still haven't seen any schedule as far as these free DLCs that are set to be coming out this year, but I have to imagine at some point we hear something. We are now over 30% done with 2021, but hopefully you guys found this one informative. Definitely an interesting status update on Cyberpunk 2077 and CD Projekt overall. But with that said, I hope to see you all next time. Later.